Officers laughed at the scan. Part 3 Tothan pulled up one final piece of footage, and it showed the human Secretary General standing before what appeared to be a broadcast system that would transmit his message to the entire planet, and the elderly. Human leader looked tired, but his eyes burned with determination, and his voice was steady when he spoke. If you come in war, we will fight, and we will fight you in our skies, and we will fight you in our cities, and we will fight you in our homes, and we will turn our entire world into a weapon, if we must. And if we fall, we will ensure that the knowledge of what you are spreads to every other species in the galaxy, and you will never have peace, and every primitive world you encounter will know that you are conquerors, and you will fight forever. The human said, and his words were not shouted or angry, but delivered with the calm certainty of someone who meant every single syllable. The Grand Admiral closed the file, and the ancient footage disappeared from the displays, and Tothan looked older and more weary than before, and he said, "The High Council realized that even if we won the battle, we would create an enemy that would never stop fighting and would never surrender and would never accept subjugation. And worse, they would inspire others to resist, and the Empire's entire system of control was built on technological superiority and the perception of invincibility, and humanity threatened both." Vexillor understood now, and the pieces fell into place in his mind, and he said, "So they quarantined Earth and erased the records and pretended the encounter never happened, and declared that any species displaying similar characteristics was to be classified as an extinction-level threat." Tothan confirmed, and he continued, "Not because they could destroy us in direct combat, but because their very existence threatened the stability of our empire and a species that refuses to be conquered and that adapts and weaponizes everything it encounters, and that would rather die fighting than submit, is the most dangerous kind of enemy imaginable." Vexillor looked at the small human ship on his view screen, and he saw it in an entirely new light, and Lieutenant Jake Morrison was still waiting patiently in his primitive vessel, and completely unaware that his presence had triggered the highest alert levels in the Caltharian Empire. "Grand Admiral, Lieutenant Morrison claims this is humanity's first contact since developing faster-than-light travel, and he seems genuine," Vexillor said carefully. Tothan nodded slowly and said, "He might be telling the truth, and 1200 cycles is a long time, and perhaps their civilization fell and rebuilt itself, and perhaps they truly do not remember us, or perhaps this is another evaluation, and they are testing our response to see if we are still a threat to them." "What are your orders, sir?" Vexillor asked, because he needed clear direction on how to handle this unprecedented situation. The Grand Admiral was silent for a long moment, and he seemed to be weighing options and considering possibilities, and finally he said, "You will maintain your distance, and you will treat them with absolute respect, and you will wait for the diplomatic fleet I am dispatching to your location. And this situation is far above your authority level, Commander, and the High Council must decide how to handle the return of humanity to the galactic stage." "And if they become hostile?" Vexillor asked, though he dreaded the answer. Tothan's expression was grim when he replied, "Then you run, Commander, and you run as fast as your ship can carry you, and you pray to the old gods that they do not decide to follow." The hologram faded and left the bridge crew in stunned silence, and Vexillor stared at the small human vessel on his screen and felt a chill run down his spine, and Lieutenant Jake Morrison was still waiting patiently and probably wondering why the meeting was taking so long, and he had no idea that his very presence had sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the Caltharian government. Vexillor made a decision, and he turned to Cretan and said, "Maintain passive scans only, and no active sensors, and nothing that could be interpreted as targeting." And then he looked at Zelnar and added, "Power down all weapon systems and lock them in safe mode." The crew moved to obey, and weapons that had been on standby were carefully deactivated and locked, and the targeting arrays were shut down completely, and the Zenith's Edge transformed from a warship ready for combat into something more like a civilian vessel. "Communications, open a channel to Lieutenant Morrison," Vexillor ordered, and he straightened his uniform and prepared himself for what might be the most important conversation of his career. Jake Morrison's face appeared on screen, and he still looked friendly and curious, and he said, "Commander Vexillor, is everything all right, and I hope there are no problems?" Vexillor chose his words with extreme care, and he said, "Lieutenant Morrison, our High Command has expressed significant interest in establishing formal diplomatic relations with Earth, and a specialized delegation is en route to our location and should arrive within the standard day. And in the meantime, we would consider it an honor if you would accept our hospitality aboard the Zenith's Edge." Jake's expression brightened with genuine pleasure, and he said, "That is fantastic news, Commander, and we would be honored, and should I dock my ship with yours?" "That will not be necessary," Vexillor replied smoothly, and he continued, "We will send a shuttle to transport you, and your vessel will be perfectly safe in our hangar bay." What he did not say was that he wanted the human ship contained where it could not scan any more of their systems, and where it could be monitored constantly, and if humanity truly was the threat the records indicated, then he was not taking any chances with an unknown vessel freely moving around his ship. "That sounds perfect," Jake agreed, and he began preparing for the transfer. Vexillor closed the channel and turned to his crew and said, "I want constant monitoring of the human vessel, once it is in our hangar, and passive scans only. But I want to know if anything changes, and anything at all." The crew nodded and began making preparations, and a shuttle was dispatched to retrieve Lieutenant Morrison, and security teams were quietly positioned throughout the ship, and medical staff were placed on standby in case of any biological threats. And the entire vessel shifted into a state of heightened alert, without actually activating any combat protocols. Cretan worked at his console and pulled up everything he could find about human biology and psychology, from the limited files that were available, and what he found was both fascinating and disturbing. And humans were endurance hunters from a high-gravity world, and their brains were disproportionately large for their body size, and they had an extended development period that lasted nearly 20 cycles, which suggested heavy investment in learning and adaptation rather than instinct. "Sir, I have been researching human evolution," Cretan reported, and he continued. "They are persistence hunters and apex predators from a world with remarkably high gravity and aggressive wildlife, and their entire biology is designed for endurance and pattern recognition and adaptability." Zelnar looked up from her station and said, "Every species has evolutionary advantages, Commander." "Yes, but humans have something unusual," Cretan replied, and he pulled up comparative data on the displays, and he said, "Their brains consume nearly 20% of their body's energy, which is an enormous investment, and they have complex social structures and advanced tool use, and most importantly, they have demonstrated the ability to adapt to almost any environment on their planet, from frozen wastelands to burning deserts." Vexillor absorbed this information and felt his concern growing, and a species that was built for adaptation and learning and endurance was exactly the kind of species that could pose the threat the old records described. The galactic cruiser Zenith's Edge moved slowly through the dark space of the Andromeda sector, its massive hull gleaming under the light of distant stars, and the crew inside performed their usual scanning duties with practiced efficiency, and Commander Vexillor stood on the bridge watching the displays with half-closed eyes because nothing interesting ever happened in this part of space, and he had been doing this job for nearly 30 cycles now, and every day felt the same as the last one. In his species, the Caltharians had ruled this region for over 3,000 cycles, and they had seen hundreds of primitive worlds and met dozens of species that barely knew how to leave their own planets, and most of them were not worth the effort of making contact. Junior Scanner Cretan sat at his station with 4 arms moving across the controls, and his secondary eyes focused on the holographic display that floated in front of him. And he was young for a Caltharian officer with only 5 cycles of service. But he was good at his job, and he rarely missed anything on the scanners, and today seemed like it would be another boring day of scanning empty space and cataloging asteroids and checking for pirates that never showed up in this sector anyway. Then something appeared on his screen, and Cretan's mandibles clicked together twice, which was a sign of mild interest among his people, and he leaned forward to get a better look at the reading, and his skin shifted from dark blue to a lighter shade, which meant he was curious about something, and he tapped a few controls to get more information about what he was seeing. "Sir, we are detecting a small vessel approaching from Sector 7, Cretan said without looking away from his display, and his voice carried the usual professional tone that all junior officers used when reporting to their commanders. Vexillor barely moved from his position near the main view screen, and he did not even bother to look at Cretan because small vessels were common enough in space, and most of them were just cargo haulers or mining ships or scout vessels from other Caltharian outposts, and none of them were worth his immediate attention unless they were in distress or acting hostile. Classification, Vexler said in a flat voice that showed how little he cared about this particular contact. Cretan worked his controls for a few more seconds and pulled up more data from the scanning array, and what he saw made him pause because the design of this vessel was not in any of their databases and he had never seen anything quite like it before. And the ship was small, very small actually, no bigger than a Caltharian shuttle, and it seemed to be using some kind of chemical propulsion system which was incredibly primitive by galactic standards, and the radiation shielding looked barely adequate for deep space travel. Unknown design, Commander, and I am running it through the database now, Cretan reported, and then he allowed himself a small laugh because the vessel looked so primitive and outdated that he could not imagine how it had survived this far from whatever planet it came from, and his mandibles clicked several times in amusement, and he added, "It appears to be quite primitive, and it has chemical propulsion systems and basic radiation shielding, and I am surprised it is still intact out here." The other officers on the bridge heard this report, and several of them looked up from their stations with expressions of mild amusement, and one of them made a joke about primitive species thinking they could explore the galaxy with technology that belonged in a museum, and another officer laughed and said something about how every few cycles they encountered some foolish species that had barely crawled out of their gravity well and thought themselves ready for the stars, and most of these primitive explorers did not survive their first real encounter with the dangers of deep space. Vexler allowed himself a tiny smile because he remembered his own early days as a junior officer, when he had been excited about every new contact and every strange reading on the scanners, but decades of service had taught him that the galaxy was a big place and most of it was empty and boring, and the truly interesting discoveries were rare, and this primitive vessel was almost certainly not one of them. "Hail them," Vexler ordered as he settled back into his command throne, which was designed to accommodate his large Caltharian frame, and he prepared himself for what would probably be a very short and simple conversation with whatever species had built this outdated ship, and he would tell them to turn around and go home, and that would be the end of it. The communications officer activated the hailing array and sent out a standard first contact signal on all common frequencies, and after a moment, the signal connected, and a visual link was established between the two ships and the main view screen. On the bridge flickered to life and showed the interior of the alien vessel. The entire bridge crew fell silent and stared at the screen because what they saw was completely unexpected and strange and slightly disturbing in a way that none of them could quite explain. And sitting in the pilot seat of the primitive vessel was a creature unlike any they had encountered before. The being was bipedal, which was common enough in the galaxy, but its proportions were unusual, and it had pale skin that looked smooth and soft and vulnerable, and it wore some kind of form-fitting blue suit that covered most of its body except for its head and hands, and it had bilateral symmetry with two eyes positioned forward on its face like a predator, and it had a shock of dark hair growing from the top of its head, which seemed like an odd evolutionary choice. And when it opened its mouth to speak, they could see flat white teeth that suggested it was an omnivore. The creature smiled at them, and the smile showed those flat teeth, and somehow that smile seemed friendly and threatening at the same time, though none of the Caltharians could say exactly why they felt that way. "Hello there," the creature said, and the universal language matrix automatically translated its words into Caltharian, and the voice was pleasant and calm, and carried no hint of fear or aggression, and the being continued, "This is Lieutenant Jake Morrison of the United Earth Space Corps, and we come in peace and request permission to dock for resupply and cultural exchange." The bridge erupted in laughter, and several officers could not contain themselves, and Cretan's entire body shook with mirth, and his forearms clutched his scanning console for support, and even the usually serious tactical officer Zelnar allowed herself a smile, and some of the junior crew members made jokes about primitive species and their ridiculous formal titles, and their naive requests for cultural exchange, as if they had anything valuable to offer to the mighty Caltharian Empire. Vexler also smiled, but he maintained his professional composure and raised one hand to quiet the laughter on the bridge. And he looked at the strange creature on the view screen and thought about how to politely tell this Lieutenant Jake Morrison that his request was amusing but ultimately pointless. "Earth?" Vexler repeated as he accessed the galactic database through his command throne's integrated computer system, and he spoke the word slowly, as if testing how it sounded, and then he added, "Scanning for your home world now." The holographics no Display in the center of the bridge shifted and changed as the computer began searching through millions of registered species and billions of planetary surveys and star charts. And the search took longer than Vexillor expected, which was unusual, because the database was extremely comprehensive and included even the most remote and primitive worlds in this sector and neighboring sectors. The bridge crew watched the search with growing curiosity, and the laughter died down as seconds turned into minutes, and the computer continued to scan through its records, and Cretan glanced at his own console and confirmed that the search was taking an abnormally long time, which suggested that this Earth place was either very far away or very obscure, or perhaps not in the database at all. Finally, a file appeared on the holographic display, and Vexillor leaned forward to read it, and his expression shifted from amusement to confusion, and then to something that might have been concern. And the file was old. Very old, actually. Dating back nearly 2,000 cycles, which was before most of the current crew members had been born. The entry contained basic planetary data for a world designated as Sol 3, which was located in an unremarkable spiral arm of a minor galaxy that the Caltharians rarely visited, and the planet had one large moon and liquid water on its surface and a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, and it seemed like a fairly typical Class M world that could support carbon-based life. Vexillor's mind raced with possibilities and questions and fears that he had never experienced in his entire military career. And he knew that this situation was far beyond his authority level, and he needed guidance from High Command immediately. And he opened a priority channel to Caltharian headquarters, which was something he had only done twice before in 30 cycles of service, and both times had been during actual combat emergencies. The response came faster than he expected, but not in the form he anticipated, and instead of a standard encrypted message, a live holographic transmission materialized in the center of the bridge, and it was marked with priority level red, which meant that someone very important was about to speak with him. And the crew immediately straightened at their stations and checked their uniforms nervously. The figure that appeared made everyone on the bridge freeze in shock, because it was Grand Admiral Tothan himself, who was the supreme commander of the entire Caltharian fleet and a member of the High Council, and he was one of the most powerful individuals in the Empire, and his presence on what should have been a routine communication meant that something was very wrong. Tothun's holographic form looked older than the official portraits showed, and his face carried deep lines of worry and exhaustion, and his eyes held a weight that spoke of terrible knowledge, and he stood in what appeared to be the council chambers themselves, which meant he had interrupted an official session to take this call. "Commander Vexillor," Tothun said, and his voice carried the weight of authority earned over 500 cycles of military service, and he continued, "You will immediately cease all contact with the human vessel and retreat to a distance of no less than 10,000 kilometers, and this is a direct order." Vexillor felt his blood chill in his veins, and he had expected many possible responses from High Command, but a direct order to retreat was not one of them, and the Caltharian Empire did not retreat from anyone, and they were the dominant force in this sector, and their military was unmatched, and yet here was the Grand Admiral himself ordering a full withdrawal from a single primitive vessel. "Grand Admiral, with respect, the human seems cooperative and has shown no hostile intent, and if I may ask," Vexillor began, but he could not finish his sentence. "You may not," Tothan interrupted sharply, and his tone left no room for argument. But then his expression softened slightly, and he seemed to age even more before their eyes, and he added, "But I will tell you anyway, because you and your crew are now in considerable danger, and you deserve to know why." The Grand Admiral turned away from the camera, and his silhouette was framed against the massive windows of the council chambers, and distant stars twinkled behind him, and when he spoke again his voice was quieter, but somehow more frightening. 1,247 cycles ago, I was a young tactical officer aboard the explorer ship Dawn's Promise, and we encountered Earth during what we believed to be a primitive stage of their development, and they had barely begun launching satellites into orbit, Tothan said, and everyone on the bridge leaned forward to hear better because this was living history speaking, and the Grand Admiral continued, "We made the same mistake you almost made, Commander, and we laughed, and here was a species that had only just touched space, and they were still fighting wars on their own planet with chemical explosives and metal projectiles, and we thought they would make suitable subjects for the Empire, and we thought they could be workers, or perhaps soldiers if they proved capable." The holographic image shifted, And suddenly the bridge displays filled with archived footage that was grainy and ancient, but clear enough to see. And it showed a Caltharian vessel that was smaller than the Zenith's edge, but still formidable, and it hovered over a blue-green planet that matched the data for Earth. We sent a diplomatic shuttle to their largest population center, which was a city they called New York, and our delegation consisted of first contact specialists and cultural analysts and linguists, and they were the best minds the Empire had to offer. And they carried gifts and technology and offers of alliance, Tothun explained, and the footage showed streets crowded with humans who were staring up at the alien vessel, and their faces showed fear and wonder and something else that was hard to define. Cretan watched the ancient footage with growing unease, and he noticed that the humans in the images looked exactly like Lieutenant Jake Morrison, and they had the same facial structure and the same body proportions and the same forward-facing predator eyes. The humans received our delegation with apparent cooperation, and their leaders asked questions about our technology and our empire and our military strength, and we answered honestly because we believed transparency would build trust. And we told them about the dozens of species we had conquered and how we maintained order across 3 sectors of space, Tothun said, and his voice dropped lower, and he added, "That was our first mistake, and we did not understand that we were being evaluated. And humans have a concept they call threat assessment, and every culture they encounter gets classified based on potential danger, and we had just classified ourselves as a threat to their survival." The footage changed again, and now it showed the Caltharian delegation being escorted through human facilities and touring their primitive factories and research centers, and the humans were smiling and friendly and asking endless questions about everything the Caltharians showed them. The meetings continued for 3 planetary rotations, and our specialists reported that humans were curious and intelligent, but technologically inferior, and they recommended standard annexation protocols and the Dawn's promise prepared to deploy occupation forces. Tothun continued, and he paused for a moment as if gathering strength for what came next. And then he said, "On the 4th day, everything changed, and our delegation entered the meeting chamber as usual. But something was different, and the humans were smiling, but their eyes were cold, and one of their leaders, who was an older male named Secretary General Carter Hayes, stood and delivered a message that I still remember word for word. The Grand Admiral's hologram shifted, and suddenly they were hearing an audio recording that had been translated into Caltharian, but it retained the measured, calm tone of the original speaker. But what caught everyone's attention and made the entire bridge fall completely silent was the classification code that appeared next to the planetary designation, and it was written in bold, pulsing crimson letters that seemed to throb with urgency and warning. The designation read, Extinction-Level threat, and below that it said, Avoid all contact, and below that it said, Quarantine protocol active. Nobody laughed now, and Cretan stared at his scanner console with wide eyes, and his skin had shifted to a pale blue color, which among his people was a sign of deep concern or fear, and Zelnar, the tactical officer, checked her own displays 3 times to make sure she was reading the classification correctly. Vexler felt his 2 hearts beating faster in his chest, and he had never seen an extinction-level threat classification before in his entire career, and he had encountered dangerous species and hostile civilizations and worlds with deadly diseases or environmental hazards, but none of them had ever carried this particular designation, and he did not even know what it meant or what criteria were used to assign such a classification. Cretan's scanner console suddenly went dark without warning, and then it rebooted itself with a harsh warning klaxon that made everyone on the bridge jump in surprise, and red lights flashed across all the displays, and a mechanical voice announced that the system had triggered an automatic security lockdown, and Cretan worked frantically at his controls, trying to understand what was happening. "Commander, the system just triggered an automatic security lockdown, and I have never seen this protocol before," Cretan said, and his voice had lost all trace of amusement and now carried a note of genuine worry. Vexler looked at the view screen where Lieutenant Jake Morrison still waited patiently, with that same friendly smile on his face, and the human seemed completely unaware that his mere presence had just triggered the highest level security alerts on a Caltharian warship, and Vexler realized that he needed to buy some time to figure out what was happening before he said or did anything that might make the situation worse. Lieutenant Morrison, stand by and we are experiencing technical difficulties, Vexillor said, and he was proud that his voice remained calm and professional, even though his mind was racing with questions and concerns. He muted the communication link and turned to Zelnar and said, "Full scan of that vessel and I want to know everything about it." "Already running, sir," Zelnar replied, and her fingers moved across her tactical console with practiced speed, and her sensor array worked overtime to gather every possible piece of data about the small human ship, and what she found made absolutely no sense according to everything she knew about physics and engineering. She transferred her findings to the main display, and everyone on the bridge stared at the readings in disbelief. In the small human ship, which was no larger than a Caltharian shuttle, showed energy readings that were impossible, and its hull composition included materials that should not exist. According to conventional understanding of matter, and the power core registered output levels that would require a reactor 3 times its apparent size. "This must be an error," Vexillor muttered, but even as he said it, he knew it was not an error because Zelnar was too good at her job to make mistakes, and the sensor array had triple-checked all its readings automatically. "Sir, there is more," Cretan said, and he had regained control of his console, though the warning lights still flashed periodically, and he continued, "I accessed the historical archives, and the file on humans is sealed under executive command. Authority and I can only view the summary, but..." He paused, and his skin shifted to an even paler shade of blue, and he added, "According to this, humanity was flagged for extinction-level threat status after a single encounter with a Caltharian scouting party 1,200 cycles ago." Vexillor felt a chill run through his body, and he asked the question that everyone on the bridge was thinking. What happened in that encounter? Cretan worked his controls and pulled up what little information he could access, and his voice was quiet when he answered. "The record is classified, but the scout ship never returned, and neither did the 3 battlecruisers sent to investigate, and after that the High Council declared the Sol system off-limits and erased most files related to the species." The bridge was completely silent now, and nobody moved and nobody spoke, and they all stared at the small, primitive-looking human ship on their view screen and tried to understand how such a vessel could possibly represent an extinction-level threat to the most powerful empire in 3 sectors of space. Officers laughed at the scan. Part 4 Vexillor listened carefully as Jake spoke about the Antarctic incident, and he noticed how the human talked about planetary near-extinction with the same calm tone one might use to discuss a historical footnote. And this casual attitude toward catastrophic events was deeply unsettling to the Caltharian commander. "You mentioned Antarctica before, and what exactly happened there?" Vexillor asked, and he genuinely wanted to understand how this species had survived such disasters. Jake leaned against one of the display cases, and his posture remained relaxed, but his eyes were thoughtful when he answered. "In 2087, a territorial dispute over Antarctic resources escalated into a limited nuclear exchange, and 3 cities were destroyed before cooler heads prevailed, and the aftermath was so devastating that every nation on Earth agreed to the Total Nuclear Disarmament Treaty, and we spent the next 50 years cleaning up our mess and learning to work together." The way Jake described the death of millions of his own people with such matter-of-fact calmness made Vexillor realize something important about humans, and they had learned to process trauma and tragedy as learning experiences rather than reasons to give up. And this resilience was perhaps more dangerous than any weapon, and yet you recovered and built a unified government and developed faster-than-light technology and began exploring the stars, Vexillor observed. "Humans are resilient," Jake agreed with a slight smile, and he added, "We are good at adapting to new circumstances, and it is kind of our thing." Before Vexillor could respond, his communicator chimed, and Cretan's voice came through, barely concealing his excitement. "Commander, you need to see this, and we have completed our analysis of the human ship." "Excuse me a moment, Lieutenant," Vexillor said, and he stepped aside to take the full report on a private channel. Cretan's findings appeared on Vexillor's personal display, and the commander felt his heart skip a beat because the human ship, which had appeared primitive from external scans, was anything but primitive, and its hull incorporated metamaterials that could shift properties based on environmental conditions. And the power core used a fusion design that was theoretically more efficient than current Caltharian systems, and the computer architecture was completely novel, using what appeared to be quantum processing integrated with biological components. Where did they get this technology? Vexillor demanded in a harsh whisper. They built it, sir, Cretan replied, and his voice carried disbelief, and he continued. I cross-referenced the design elements with known galactic technology, and there are no matches, and this is entirely original human engineering. That is impossible, and they only achieved faster-than-light travel 5 cycles ago, Vexillor protested. Yes, sir, and which means they went from chemical rockets to faster-than-light travel in less than 2 centuries, Cretan said, and he added, For context, it took our species 1,800 cycles to make the same leap. Vexillor closed the channel and returned to Jake, and the human was examining a sculpture depicting the founding of the Caltharian Empire. And he seemed completely relaxed. But the commander now saw him differently, and this was not just a friendly explorer but a representative of a species that innovated at a pace that defied all known patterns of technological development. Lieutenant Morrison, I wonder if you might satisfy my curiosity about something. Vexillor began carefully, and he continued. Your ship incorporates some unusual design elements, and did you have assistance from other species in developing your technology? Jake looked genuinely puzzled, and he said, Assistance and no commander, and as I mentioned, you are the first alien species we have encountered, and all our technology is homegrown and developed through trial and error and a lot of hard work. Your faster-than-light drive, for instance, and how long did it take to develop? Vexillor pressed. Jake's face lit up with enthusiasm, and he said, The Alcubierre-Chen drive, and that is actually a fascinating story, and the theoretical framework was proposed back in the 1990s by a physicist named Miguel Alcubierre, but the energy requirements were astronomical, and we could not make it practical until Dr. Lisa Chen had a breakthrough in 2113 using controlled exotic matter generation, and even then it took another 7 years of testing before we trusted it enough for a manned mission. The human spoke about bending space-time with the casual ease of discussing a cooking recipe, and Vexillor realized that Jake genuinely did not understand how impressive his species' achievements were, because to humans this rapid innovation was simply normal. On my world, such advances typically require thousands of cycles of incremental progress, Vexillor said slowly, and he asked, How do humans innovate so quickly? Jake considered the question seriously, and he said, I think it is because we build on each other's work, and human civilization has always been about collaboration. Even when we were fighting, and we share information freely and publish our research and challenge each other's ideas. And every generation stands on the shoulders of the ones before. And then he added something that sent chills through Vexillor's spine. Plus, we have a saying that necessity is the mother of invention, and when we needed to solve the climate crisis, we invented carbon sequestration, and when we needed to leave Earth, we figured out faster-than-light travel, and humans are really good at solving problems when our survival depends on it. That last statement hung in the air like a weapon, and though Jake had delivered it with innocent enthusiasm, Vexillor heard the underlying message clearly, and humans were at their most dangerous when threatened, and they would innovate and adapt, and overcome any obstacle if they believed their survival was at stake. Vexillor's communicator chimed again, and this time it was a priority message from Grand Admiral Tothan, and the message was brief, but urgent. Commander, the diplomatic fleet has arrived ahead of schedule, and bring the human to Hangar Bay 1. Immediately, and be very careful because we have decoded more of the old files, and what we found is deeply troubling. Understood, sir, Vexillor replied, and then he turned to Jake and said, Lieutenant Morrison, our diplomatic delegation has arrived, and if you will follow me, we will proceed to the formal first contact ceremonies. Excellent, Jake said cheerfully, and he fell into step beside the commander, and he added, I should probably warn you that I am not great at formal ceremonies, and we humans tend to be pretty casual, and I hope I do not accidentally violate any protocols. As they walked through the corridors, Vexillor could not help but notice how Jake's casual demeanor never quite masked the constant assessment in his eyes, and the human was always watching and always learning and cataloging every detail of the ship and its operations, and this behavior reminded Vexillor of how a scout would map enemy territory. They entered the main hangar bay and found it transformed from when Jake had first arrived, and the diplomatic fleet had sent down not just ambassadors but an entire security detail, and 20 Caltharian honor guards stood at attention in full ceremonial armor, and 3 members of the High Council itself had made the journey, which was an unprecedented gesture for a first contact situation. Jake took in the elaborate reception with wide eyes, and he said, "Wow, this is quite the welcome, and I'm starting to feel underdressed." Grand Admiral Tothan stepped forward, and his expression was carefully neutral, and he was flanked by 2 other council members, and behind them stood rows of diplomats and military officers and scientists, and all of them were focused intently on the single human in the simple blue uniform. Officers laughed at the scan. Part 5 Tothan studied Jake's face carefully before answering, and the Grand Admiral seemed to be weighing how much to reveal, and finally he said, "That Lieutenant Morrison is precisely what we need to understand. Because if humans could pose an extinction-level threat to our empire with 9th century technology, we must know what you are capable of now that you have reached the stars." The hangar bay fell silent, and everyone present understood that they had reached a critical moment, and Jake stood alone facing dozens of Caltharian officers and diplomats and guards, and yet somehow he did not seem intimidated or afraid, and his posture remained relaxed but ready, and his eyes moved across the assembled Caltharians with the calm assessment of someone evaluating a situation. Jake was quiet for several long seconds, and his expression showed that calculations were running behind his eyes, and he was processing this information and deciding how to respond, and finally he spoke, and his voice was calm, but it carried an edge that had not been there before. "Grand Admiral, I think there has been a misunderstanding, and humans in the 9th century barely had metallurgy, and we were nowhere near threatening an interstellar empire, and either your records are wrong, or something else is going on here." "Our records are not wrong," Tothan stated firmly, and he gestured to the holographic display which showed images of Earth from 1200 cycles ago, and he said, "The data is comprehensive and verified, and which leaves us with limited possibilities." "Or," Jake said quietly, and his voice cut through the tension like a blade, "you are testing me, and you want to see how humans respond to a potential threat scenario, and you want to know if we are still the same species that scared you away all those centuries ago." The Grand Admiral's expression revealed nothing, and he simply watched Jake with ancient eyes that had seen 500 cycles of life, and he said, "And if we are testing you, Lieutenant Morrison, what does your response tell us?" Jake met Tothan's, gazed directly, and for a moment the friendly explorer vanished completely, and in his place stood something harder and more dangerous, and he said, "It tells you that humans do not like being threatened, and it tells you that we remember those who try to intimidate us, and it tells you that if you are looking for a reason to consider us enemies, you will not find it, because we came here in peace, and we will leave in peace." And then his voice dropped lower and became even more intense. "But we will remember this conversation, Grand Admiral, and we will remember it very well." The tension in the hangar stretched like a physical thing, and Vexillor found himself holding his breath, and every guard had their hand near their weapon, and every diplomat looked ready to flee, and the moment hung suspended between peace and something far more dangerous. Then unexpectedly Tothan smiled, and it was a sad smile that was weary and resigned, and he said, "There it is, and that response right there is exactly what we needed to see." And he turned to the other council members and added, "They have not changed, and 1200 cycles have passed, and their civilization has risen and fallen and rebuilt itself. But the core of what makes them human remains the same." Jake's defensive posture eased slightly, but his eyes remained watchful, and he said, "Grand Admiral, I would appreciate some clarity about what exactly is happening here." Tothan nodded and gestured for everyone to lower their weapons and relax. And he said, "Lieutenant Morrison, you are not being threatened, and this was indeed a test, but not the kind you think. And we needed to know if modern humans retained the same characteristics that made your ancestors so formidable. And now we have our answer." The Grand Admiral walked closer to Jake, and his movements were slow and deliberate and non-threatening, and he said, 1200 cycles ago, humans taught the Caltharian Empire a lesson we have never forgotten, and you taught us that technological superiority means nothing if your opponent refuses to accept defeat, and you showed us that a species willing to sacrifice everything for their freedom is unconquerable, and you demonstrated that intelligence and adaptability can overcome almost any advantage." Jake listened carefully, and his expression showed confusion mixed with pride, and he said, I still do not understand what happened in that encounter, and if you have records, why not share them? Because, Tothan said heavily, the High Council erased most of those records out of shame, and we encountered primitive humans who should have been easy to conquer. And instead, they reverse-engineered our technology in 3 days and infiltrated our computer systems and built weapons that could threaten our ships, and they did all of this while maintaining diplomatic courtesy and offering us the chance to leave peacefully. Jake's eyes widened and he said, "That sounds like humans, and we have always been good at learning from our enemies." "Too good," Tothan agreed, and he continued, "Your ancestors told us that if we came in war you would fight forever, and that you would turn your entire world into a weapon, and that you would ensure every species in the galaxy knew we were conquerors. And the High Council realized that even if we won, we would lose, because you would inspire every primitive species to resist, and our entire empire was built on the perception of invincibility." The Grand Admiral paused and then said something that shocked everyone present. "So we retreated and we declared Earth off limits, and we classified humanity as an extinction-level threat, not because you could destroy us militarily, but because your very existence threatened the foundations of our empire, and a species that refuses to be conquered is the most dangerous enemy imaginable." Jake absorbed this information, and his expression shifted through several emotions and surprise and understanding, and finally something like respect, and he said, "And now we have returned to space, and you need to know if we are still that same species." "Yes," Tothan confirmed, and he added, "And the answer is clearly yes, and you carry the same spirit and the same refusal to be intimidated and the same willingness to stand alone against superior force." And then his expression softened, and he said, "But Lieutenant Morrison, I want you to understand something important, and this does not have to be a confrontation. And the Caltharian Empire has changed in 1200 cycles, and we learned from our encounter with your ancestors, and we learned that conquest is not the only path to strength." Jake's posture relaxed further, and he said, "What are you proposing, Grand Admiral?" Tothan gestured to the assembled diplomats and scientists, and he said, "We propose a genuine alliance, and not subjugation or conquest, but a partnership between equals, and humanity has something the Caltharian Empire desperately needs, and you have the ability to innovate and adapt at speeds we cannot match, and we have resources and knowledge and stability that could benefit Earth, and together we could build something stronger than either of us alone." The words hung in the air, and Jake considered them carefully, and he said, "The United Earth government would need guarantees, and we would need assurances of sovereignty and mutual respect, and complete transparency about intentions and capabilities. All of which we are prepared to offer," Tothan said, and he pulled out a data device and handed it to Jake, and he continued, "This contains our formal proposal, including territorial boundaries and technology exchange protocols and defensive alliance terms, and everything is negotiable. And we are not dictating terms, Lieutenant Morrison, and we are asking for partnership." Jake took the device and examined it briefly, and he said, "I will need to transmit this to Earth for review, and my government will want to send proper diplomats and scientists and military advisors to negotiate the details." "Of course," Tothan agreed, and he added, "We expected nothing less, and in fact we insist on it, and this is too important for snap decisions, and both our peoples deserve time to consider what this alliance could mean. We thank you for your openness about the Caltharian Empire's capabilities and intentions, and in the interest of the same transparency, we feel it is only fair to share some information with you. And 72 hours ago, your ship's defensive systems were compromised and your weapons are currently offline, and your communications array has been rerouted through our satellites, and your ship's main reactor has been fitted with a remote shutdown device that we can trigger at any time," the human voice said, and the words were delivered without emotion or anger and just cold, factual statements. The bridge of the Zenith's edge fell into stunned silence, and nobody moved and nobody breathed, and they all stared at the hologram in disbelief. Tothan's face reappeared, and he said, "We thought it was a bluff, and our ship's system showed normal operation on every level, but then they demonstrated and they shut down our engines for exactly 10 seconds, and the Dawn's Promise went into freefall before they reactivated the engines, and they cycled our weapons systems through a diagnostic routine that we had not programmed, and they played our own internal security footage on every screen on the ship, just to prove they had access to everything." Zelnar spoke up from her tactical station, and her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "But how? And a species that primitive could not possibly." That is what we thought, Tothan agreed, and his expression was grim, and he continued. We were wrong, and humans, we discovered, have a particular genius for what they call reverse engineering. And in the 3 days our delegation was on their planet, their scientists had analyzed every piece of technology we brought, and every component, in our shuttle and even the biological implants in our diplomatic staff, and they mapped our computer systems and cracked our encryption and found vulnerabilities in our networks that our own engineers did not know existed. The Grand Admiral's expression hardened and he said, but that was not the truly terrifying part, and the humans gave us a choice, and we could leave peacefully and take our delegation and our ship and never return, or we could attempt to resist, and they had prepared several contingencies. More footage appeared on screen, and this time it showed human military facilities that had been hastily constructed during the 3-day negotiation period, and there were missile batteries pointed skyward and energy weapons of unusual design. And most disturbing of all, there was what appeared to be modified Caltharian technology integrated into human systems. They had built weapons based on our own designs, Tothan explained, and his voice carried a note of reluctant admiration, and he said, in 3 days they built weapons that could potentially harm our ship, and more than that, they had deployed over 200 of these facilities across their planet, and all of them were networked together, and all of them were aimed at our single vessel. Vexillor found his voice and asked the question that everyone was thinking, what did you do? The Secretary General explained their doctrine to us, Tothan replied, and he pulled up more footage that showed the human leader standing before a large assembly of other humans, and the leader spoke with calm conviction, and Tothan translated, they call it mutually assured destruction, and they were willing to die and to sacrifice their entire species if necessary to destroy what they perceived as a threat, and they were very clear that if we attempted to conquer them, they would make it so costly that the Empire would be crippled. The bridge crew exchanged horrified glances, and Cretan's skin had turned almost white with fear, and the idea of an entire species willing to commit suicide just to hurt their enemies was beyond anything the Caltharians could comprehend. Our captain rejected their demands and called for reinforcements, Tothan said quietly, and he added, 3 battle cruisers arrived within 2 planetary rotations, and they were state-of-the-art warships with enough firepower to crack a continent. The footage showed the arrival of the Caltharian reinforcements, and the massive warships took up positions around Earth, and their weapons arrays powered up and prepared to demonstrate the full might of the Empire. The humans were waiting, and they had used those 2 days to infiltrate our communication networks across all 4 ships. And when our fleet commander ordered the attack, nothing happened, and our weapons would not fire and our shields would not activate. And then the humans demonstrated what they had built in less than a week of having access to our technology. Tothan explained, and the pain in his voice was clear. The footage showed brief flashes of energy weapons firing from Earth's surface, and they were primitive by Caltharian standards but effective enough, and one of the battle cruisers sustained damage to its external sensors, and it was not destroyed, but the message was absolutely clear. We could have won, Tothan said quietly, and he looked directly at Vexillor through the hologram, and he said, eventually, and with enough ships and enough time, we could have overwhelmed their defenses and taken the planet, but the cost would have been enormous, and the humans made one final point that convinced the High Council to order a full retreat. Vexillor watched this exchange with growing amazement, and he had never seen the Caltharian Empire offer terms as an equal to any species, and they had always been the dominant power and the ones who set conditions, and yet here was the Grand Admiral himself treating this single human as a representative of a peer civilization. Jake seemed to sense the significance of the moment, and he extended his hand again and said, Grand Admiral Tothan, on behalf of humanity, I accept your proposal for formal negotiations, and I cannot promise what my government will decide, but I can promise that we will approach these discussions with open minds and good faith. Tothan took the offered hand and shook it firmly, and he said, that is all we ask, Lieutenant Morrison, and that is all we ask. And then he added with a slight smile, though I suspect your diplomats will drive much harder bargains than you realize, and humans have a reputation for being excellent negotiators. We learned from the best, Jake said with a grin, and the tension in the hangar finally broke, and several people laughed, and the atmosphere shifted from confrontation to cautious optimism. Over the next several hours, arrangements were made for Jake to return to Earth with the Alliance. Proposal and Caltharian diplomats would follow in a separate ship to begin formal negotiations, and scientists from both species began discussing technology exchange possibilities, and military officers talked about mutual defense scenarios, and it seemed that perhaps something good could come from this encounter. Vexillor found himself alone with Jake for a moment before the human departed, and he said, "Lieutenant Morrison, may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, Commander," Jake replied. "When the Grand Admiral confronted you and suggested we might be testing you, were you actually concerned, or was that confidence genuine?" Vexillor asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, and then he said honestly, "I was terrified, Commander, and I am just one man on a small ship surrounded by a military force that could destroy me in seconds." And then his expression hardened slightly, and he added, "But fear and confidence are not opposites, and humans learned long ago that you can be afraid and still stand your ground, and you can recognize superior force and still refuse to back down, and that is what makes us human, and we feel fear just like everyone else, but we do not let it control us." Vexillor understood then why the High Council had been so afraid of humanity, and it was not their technology or their weapons or even their ability to adapt, and it was their absolute refusal to surrender, even when surrender was the logical choice in a species that could feel fear and act anyway was truly unstoppable. Jake departed in his small ship, and the Zenith's edge maintained its position and waited for the diplomatic fleet to arrive, and Vexillor stood on the bridge watching the human vessel accelerate toward the faster-than-light threshold, and Cretan approached and said, "Sir, do you think this alliance will work?" Vexillor considered the question and thought about everything he had learned about humans in the past day, and finally he said, "I think, Cretan, that the Caltharian Empire just made the smartest decision in its 3,000-cycle history, and because if we had tried to conquer humanity, we would have won the battle but lost everything else." And then he smiled and added, "And now, instead of having the most dangerous enemy imaginable, we might just have the most valuable ally, and the galaxy will never be the same." The shuttle returned and docked in the main hangar bay, and Vexillor went down to meet their guest personally, because protocol demanded it, and also because he wanted to observe this human up close and assess the threat for himself. Lieutenant Jake Morrison stepped off the shuttle with an easy confidence that reminded Vexillor of a predator entering new territory, and the human wore a simple blue uniform with minimal insignia, and he carried no visible weapons, and his movements seemed relaxed and casual, but there was something about the way his eyes swept across the hangar that suggested he was cataloging every detail and every exit and every piece of equipment. "Lieutenant Morrison, welcome aboard the Zenith's Edge," Vexillor said formally, and he extended his hand in the human greeting gesture that he had hastily researched. Jake took the offered hand and shook it firmly, but not aggressively, and his grip was surprisingly strong for someone from what should have been a lower gravity world, and he smiled and said, "Commander Vexillor, it is an honor to be here, and your ship is impressive." They walked through the corridors, and Vexillor led Jake toward the conference chamber he had prepared, and along the way they passed crew members who tried not to stare at the alien visitor, and Jake made eye contact with each one and offered friendly nods and even attempted a few words in broken Caltharian, which he had apparently been studying during his wait in the conference chamber. Vexillor had arranged displays of Caltharian culture and technology and art pieces and historical artifacts and samples of their scientific achievements, and Jake examined each item with genuine interest and asked thoughtful questions about their history and their society and their journey to the stars. "Your species achieved spaceflight approximately 4,000 cycles ago," Jake observed while reading from one of the historical displays, and he continued, "That is remarkable continuity, and human civilization is much younger, and we have only had organized societies for about 10,000 years, and we have nearly destroyed ourselves several times in that period." Vexillor seized on this admission and asked carefully, "Nearly destroyed yourselves, and how did that happen?" Jake's expression became more somber, and he said, "Wars mostly, and we developed nuclear weapons in the mid-20th century before we had the wisdom to control them, and we came very close to global annihilation during what we call the Cold War, which was a decades-long standoff between two major power blocks, and then there were the climate wars and the resource conflicts and the Antarctic incident." Lieutenant Jake Morrison of Earth, Tothan said formally, and his voice carried across the entire hangar bay. I am Grand Admiral Tothan of the Caltharian High Council, and on behalf of our empire, I welcome you and your species to the greater galactic community. Jake executed a crisp military salute and then extended his hand in the human greeting, and he said, Grand Admiral, the honor is ours, and humanity looks forward to learning from the Caltharian people and establishing a lasting friendship between our civilizations. Tothan accepted the handshake, and Vexilor saw something flicker in the Grand Admiral's eyes, and it might have been recognition, or perhaps memory of another human handshake, 1,200 cycles ago in a city called New York. Lieutenant Morrison, there are matters of considerable importance we must discuss regarding Earth's entry into galactic affairs, Tothan said, and he continued, would you be willing to participate in a more detailed exchange of information? Absolutely, Jake agreed readily, and he said, I am authorized to share any information that does not compromise Earth's security, and we believe transparency builds trust. Trust, Tothan repeated softly, and then he said, yes, quite important indeed, and tell me, Lieutenant, in your studies of Earth history, have you ever encountered records of previous contact with alien species? Jake's expression shifted slightly and became more guarded, and his easy smile remained. But his eyes sharpened, and he said, there are legends and stories, of course, and every culture has tales of visitors from the stars, but if you are asking whether we have official records of confirmed contact before, now the answer is no. And then he asked the critical question, why do you ask, Grand Admiral? Tothan exchanged glances with the other council members, and a silent communication passed between them, and then the Grand Admiral looked back at Jake and said, because Lieutenant Morrison, 1,200 of your years ago my people encountered Earth, and the meeting did not end well, and we retreated, and have avoided your world ever since. And the fact that you have no memory of this encounter raises interesting questions. For the first time, Jake's friendly demeanor cracked, and his eyes sharpened into something harder and more focused, and his posture shifted almost imperceptibly into something more defensive and ready, and he said, 1,200 years ago, and that would have been the 9th century by our calendar, and we have limited records from that period, mostly oral traditions and fragmentary text. And then he asked with careful precision, are you certain it was Earth you encountered? Quite certain, Tothan replied, and he gestured to one of his aides who activated a holographic display, and he said, we have extensive documentation of the event, including footage and sensor data, and the planet matches your world exactly, but the humans we met had only primitive technology and no spaceflight and no advanced weapons, and yet they managed to convince us to abandon all contact with your species. Jake's jaw tightened, and he asked the question everyone was thinking, how?